Coyotes. Like me, I bet you've heard all kinds of stories about them. How about this one? Wile E. Coyote? You remember him, don't you? Then there's the mythical background that Native Americans consider them to be. They consider him to be the comical trickster, to have divine magical powers, and some believe them to be signs of bad things to come. And when you really start digging into the history of coyotes, there is so much more to go into. Now, in today's episode, Dr. Stanley Gehrt, he joins me. Now, he's led one of the largest studies ever of urban coyotes. Now, for almost 25 years, he's been studying coyotes all throughout the Chicago area, and to be exact, really Cook County. Now, I want you to think about this. There are generations, and I mean generations of coyotes that have only ever lived in a city, not out in the wild. City-dwelling coyotes. My guess, you've never seen a coyote running in a big or even a small city. Now, guess what? These tricksters have been right in front of you the entire time, and you most likely will never, ever see them. There are over 6,000 living in Chicago, just to give you an example. In this episode, we talk everything coyote. We debunk some of the false narratives people believe, and we talk who and what coyotes really are. Stan is a wealth of knowledge, and you're really going to appreciate his narrative. Last thing though, I'm sorry, Wile E. Coyote still doesn't catch the Roadrunner in this one, but I'm sure this trickster is going to catch your attention.
For real, 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 for real. Got a bunch of furry friends and I love them all the same. I'm an animal lover, veterinarian is the name. Let's share some pet stories from heartwarming to strange, losses and gains, from wacky to insane. For real. You're now tuned in to For Real with your host, Mark Kyle.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the For Real podcast. Today, I've got a great one. I've been really excited about doing this thing. My guest is Dr. Stanley Gehrt. We're going to get into some really, really cool stuff. Stan, thanks so much for joining the show, and I can't wait to get into your background and what you're doing. It's really cool.
You bet, and thank you for the invitation.
Well, I know your time's a lot more busy than mine, and you taking the time means a lot to me. I thought what we would do, let's get into your background, how you got to what we're going to talk about today, and what your journey was getting there, and then we'll dive into coyotes.
Sure. So that's an open-ended thing. I'll go in the weeds to a certain extent. So I was born and raised in Kansas, so that's starting at the beginning. But I was a kid that spent most of my time outside in a semi-rural or very rural environment. And I became infatuated with wildlife early on. My main task in life at that early age was to try and catch every single animal I could see or find.
Wow.
And of course, I had to bring them all home. So that's how it started. And my parents were very accommodating to a point. There were some animals they would not let me bring in. But for the most part, that was my experience. And then I took a number of different turns and twists during those early years, and then found myself in college and then discovering wildlife research, and started off. I volunteered for a wolf project way back in the early 1980s, when wolves were actually, at least Western wolves, were not really present much in the U.S. And so that was the project I was working on, was actually trying to document the presence of whatever few wolves there were in the Rocky Mountains. And I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. And so that's when I decided to go into graduate school, and also became kind of infatuated with coyotes or canids in general. I came back to Kansas to go to grad school. I originally wanted to study coyotes because that was the closest thing we had to wolves, but at that time there was no funding to do that. And so I studied other things, and then fast forward, went through grad school, studied a bunch of other things, and got my first position as a research biologist. Unfortunately, at least I thought at the time, it was in Chicago. And that was the last thing I ever expected I would find myself doing. And I was thinking, well, I'll take this job for 1 year and then hopefully get out into the wilderness, which is what drew me into the profession in the first place. But once I got established in Chicago, I realized that the whole idea of urban wildlife at that time, and this is in the early 1990s, was still a limited field. And basically, anything you do is a pretty significant contribution to the field as well as to the public. And so,
Sure.
but I thought I still kind of wanted to leave because I did kind of, well, and just a lot of people, just so many people. And again, I come from Kansas where uh, the city of Chicago has more people than the state of Kansas by far. Um, so anyway, last thing I thought I'd be doing is studying coyotes, but sure enough, coyotes appeared and I was able to begin a coyote study just out of the blue. So that's kind of how I eventually got there. But it was the last thing I expected.
What's funny is I'm a Midwest guy too. I don't know if when we talked before if I told you. So I was born in St. Louis. And I don't know that kids have the same opportunities that at least I had when I was growing up, and probably you too, is there were a bunch of woods around there. My brother and I, we're 2 years apart. I mean, that's what we did during the day. We were walking, trouncing through the woods. I remember there was a guy that we had a big woods separating our property and another property. A guy had a compound with wolves. And I remember that. And I remember collecting turtles and putting nail polish on them. I remember all that kind of stuff. So we probably had, not mine's probably wasn't at your level, but it's somewhat of a similar growing up thing that we did.
Sure, absolutely. Mine might have been a little more once I got older and
Sounds like it.
could once I could have a gun. That was like an amazing thing. And so I did go through my period of hunting. Couldn't wait to get my license, or at least my my pre-license, and I basically shot everything I could.
Well, that's typical kids.
Yeah, I got that out. I did that for a while, and then, but then that was well before I started actually studying these animals. And so, obviously, once you start really investing in some of these species that we study, it then becomes pretty difficult. You see them in a different light, and it becomes harder to do things that I used to do as a kid. But other things that I did as a kid, such as the trapping, the catching, and basically handling the animals, I still do that all the time.
Wow, that's awesome. One of the reasons why we talked a little bit about this. I live in Austin, and we've got a big coyote population here, and I have a park next to me that my dog got out one night and was chasing the coyotes. I always thought they were kind of trying to corral her, but I think it's a little bit different now that I've read about it. But I saw that. But I have a really good friend of mine that's a pilot for United. His name's Randy Hodge. I call him the Epilep guy. But he lives in, I know you spent some time down in Corpus. Do you remember the town Brenham at all? It's where the Blue ice cream's from, by any chance?
I do. Yep.
Well, they live out there, and one day we were talking, and I want to, because I know you're an expert in urban, what's going on with coyotes urban wise and all that. I want to get into the project, but his dog one day they look out and they've got a big piece of property, and he look out and his dog's with two coyotes. They're young, and now the dog runs out and they hang out together all the time. He was all worried that the coyotes were going to eat him, but based on what I've read, and I wanted to ask you this question. Is that an untruth that they really aren't trying to attack the dogs unless they feel threatened, right? Is that pretty much the truth or what?
Yeah, that's pretty much the truth. I mean, there's a little bit of going back and forth. I would say that in many cases, in fact, most cases that I see, when coyotes interact with the dog, it's often amicable. I mean, it's just one of those
Right.
things.
They look like they're playing. Yeah.
Right, they look like they want to play. We do have some really rare cases of dogs trying to join coyote packs, which is always kind of funny.
Why?
Yeah, so it's not always this antagonistic thing, and sometimes coyotes are just curious about those animals, and they just want to know more about them.
Right.
It just gets to be different when, like for example, we just finished the mating season, which is in February, and that's when coyotes are more aggressive and defensive toward other animals that look like themselves, and which includes dogs. And so that's an instinct that they've honed for a long time. So there are times when coyotes will be aggressive toward dogs, but a lot of times they're not.
Is there any documented cases of dogs and coyotes interbreeding?
Yeah, they do. They can interbreed. It's not common at all for it to naturally occur.
Uh huh.
So in the cases where we've had coyotes and dogs breeding, it's almost always, at least that I'm aware of, been intentional in the sense that people have
I'll try to mate them
exactly. They tried to create like the perfect hunting dog or something like that.
like the zebras, right? The zebras and the horses. So let's get into. So you're in Cook County, and yours is the longest project that's ever been done on urban. Because I'm curious because when my buddy Randy was talking about that, I was thinking, I'm wondering with all the urban sprawl, what's going on with the coyotes. And I know you told me it's a little bit different than what I was thinking, but let's talk about that and what you've done and kind of walk through the process and just everything, the history, everything. I find it fascinating.
Sure. Well, I think, yeah, what you're referring to. So the natural assumption that people have is when you have coyotes living around neighborhoods, it's usually because we developed into their territory. So they were there first, and because of urban sprawl, we developed into their territories, and that is certainly one of the things that does happen. So that is true,
Sure.
and that's one way that we have co-occurrence taking place between coyotes and people. But we also have cases where, in fact, a growing number of cases where coyotes have moved into cities. They've moved into places where they did not occur before in the completely developed. So they're actually, in those instances, they're encroaching on us, if you want to think about that. And so in Cook County, that was definitely the case. So that was an instance where coyotes were moving into the urban parts of Cook County where they did not occur before. So those are the coyotes that we're studying, that kind of relationship. Other studies, sometimes when you hear about an urban coyote study in some other places, a lot of their work takes place along the periphery of the urban or the metropolitan area, along the edges, and that's where you're probably looking at coyotes and people, where people encroached onto coyote territories, and that relationship can be a little bit different. But in this case, these coyotes that we study, they're living among people, and it's been going on for quite a while. So they've got a longer history with people, and especially living in really congested areas.
I know, that's wild. So I know you started that study in 1999, but obviously they've been there way before that. And there's reasons. We got into it a little bit when we talked the other day. One of the reasons is that there's different coyote packs that have their own territory, and then it pushes people away from that. Is that how it works, or how does that work?
Yeah. So what happens? I think what you're referring to. So the typical coyote population starts with the alpha pair, and the alpha pair creates their pack through their own offspring. So the pups that they raise now become this group. Well, they live in a territory that's their space that they defend from other coyotes, and so it's a very highly structured system, and only that family group gets to live in that territory. So those are the territorial resident animals, and those form the foundation of the population. But then another important component of the population would be the solitary transients, and they make up about, at least in our population, they make up about a third
Mhm.
of the coyotes that live in any area, and those are both males or females. And these are animals that leave those family groups, are forced out, especially if they start to become sexually mature. Then they have to leave their family unit, and they form their own groups, or at least they're looking for a vacancy. So they're floating around looking for vacancies. So they have these huge areas that they're traveling, and they're always out there, but you rarely see them. And they will, if you were to remove some of those residents from an area, and if it's an area that actually was, sufficient for taking care of coyotes. In other words, there's enough food there,
Right.
then almost within days or weeks, solitary coyotes will take it, they will fill up that void. So it's a lot like water looking for space. So that's why it's really hard to exterminate coyotes from an area, is because those solitary animals are floating around, and they quickly fill up the void.
Yeah, they find a new void. So when the solitary guys do are there several that are always by themselves? Are they just looking for their mate, or I mean, are they just solitary?
Hmm.
They're both.
They're almost always by themselves. They're solitary.
Huh,
And they are looking for a mate. And we do have cases where, so let's say you have your typical, Texas area where there's some amount of hunting or trapping going on. So there's a certain number of animals that are removed just on a regular basis. So that's providing open spaces or vacancies for these solitary animals to move in. And so they don't have to wait very long. They just need to live long enough to where that vacancy opens up. And then they will hopefully attract a mate very quickly, and they usually do. But in the city environment, at least where we are, the population has grown to the point where it's hard to find vacancies.
right.
And so some of these solitary coyotes, they may have to be a solitary animal for a couple of years before they can finally find a spot. And we do have some cases, again, in this kind of a saturated landscape, where we do have some of these poor solitary animals do hook up with a mate, but they don't have a territory yet. So they will try and eke out like this little corner in between two territories and see if they can't make that into a territory. And so you will see some of these pairings temporarily get together and temporarily try to hold a territory. And sometimes they're successful with some really weird shaped territories. And then most cases they're not. And then they'll have to give up and separate and move on.
So in the city, how big is a territory typically? Is it a few blocks, or I mean, how does that work?
So it does vary depending on what part of that metropolitan area you're talking about. So
Right,
in the suburban areas where you have a lot of green spaces, like large parks,
right,
in Cook County, you have these things called forest preserves, which are county protected areas. And so those are large blocks of green spaces, and then you have your golf courses, cemeteries. When you have enough green space, their territories actually become pretty small. In fact, they will usually be somewhere between maybe two square miles at tops.
wow,
But there can be some. We've got some that are actually smaller. We've had one of my favorite coyotes in his group. They maintained a territory that was only about 3/4 of a square mile total. I mean that, and he lived there for 10 years, for a decade, all within 3/4 of a square mile. So, but if you move in toward the really developed areas, like toward the city core,
right.
there's less space available for them. They have to expand their territories, and so then they actually get pretty big, and they may be more like 6 or 7 square miles. But a lot of that is not usable because it's all buildings and
Yeah.
concrete, basically. So
Yeah, that's the question I have. So when they're like downtown, the Sears Water Tower or whatever it is
yeah.
in that area, do they call it a den where they sleep? Is it called a den?
So then, if you're talking about like a thing that they burrow into, that's it is a den. They only use it to raise their litter. They don't
Okay.
They don't use it then to, like, sleep in at other times of the year. They don't like to go underground.
Okay. So when they're in the city, wherever they're sleeping, and if there's parts where there's no, is it generally some kind of a green space, or are they like in an alley behind a trash can or something? I mean, I'm just trying to visualize it.
It's all of the above.
Wow.
So if there is green space available for them, and you would be surprised how many little nooks and crannies of green space, we might not call it green space because it doesn't look like your traditional wildlife habitat, right? But all they need is maybe like three bushes together that creates enough cover for them to curl up in during the day. And we could walk past that and not even look at it,
Right.
not even notice it. And in fact, they do that quite a bit. So we have animals that are actually curled up and sleeping during the day, kind of in the open, but in areas that we don't notice them. So it works for them. And then we have other cases where they are in a very secluded area. We have some cases where they're using some of our developments, like there are like construction areas or other places where people are fenced out,
Right.
and that allows coyotes a safe space to go in and sleep in during the day. They also use things like the river corridors. The rivers often have blocked access in during certain segments, and so a lot of them are using that. And same thing with railroad tracks and other forms of rail lines or other, I guess, transportation avenues. There's always usually an easement along with those, and often there's some vegetation, usually woody stuff that we plant there, like trees or bushes, and that provides cover for them as well.
Are they down in Cabrini Green in that area too, like with housing projects and all that? Do they live down there too?
Yeah, I mean, there is the Cabrini Greens are gone now, but
They are now?
yeah, but you're talking about the really rough
Yeah.
parts of the South Side of Chicago, and yeah, in fact, we worked really hard the latter stages of the project. So the last decade, we moved in to the South Side to try and trap coyotes if they existed there, and radio collar them and be able to follow them. And sure enough, there's coyotes down there, and they have an interesting life, but they figure out how to use that space too.
Well, it sounds like these guys are really, really intelligent if they learn how to adapt like that. I mean, I don't know. I know enough to be dangerous, but not really that much about them. Are they pretty smart animals?
Yeah, they're top of the line, smart.
Okay, wow.
For real, 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 for real.
And we'll be right back. We are supported by PrepVet, providing stem cell therapy for pets.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at prepvet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
I want to get into what they eat in that, but I want to hold off on that for a second. So when I was looking at you guys' website, and I can't remember, it's probably on the project website or whatever. They had some articles about the one that I think you'd written about, Coyote 358 or whatever, that passed away, that you one of your early ones. Can you talk about how you labeled them or collar them with their numbers, and then what's the oldest coyote, what number that is now, and everything. Just tell me everything. Anyways.
Right, right, right. Go back to the beginning. So when we began this study, we started this study in Chicago back in 2000. We caught our very first coyote in March of 2000. That was a young female. She was one of those solitary transient animals, and so she was coyote number one. And we decided at that point we would just use numbers to be able to identify them because it's simple. But we also thought we would only be doing a 1 year study, and it would be a pretty small, and we wouldn't really find that much about them. So she was coyote number one, and so since that time, each coyote just has its own ID number, and that's how we recognize them or record them in our database. So coyote number one was the first one to also, just by some freak of accident, also was the longest running animal that we radio tracked over time. So the first 10 years of the study, she was on the air. So we were able to radio track her for over a decade.
Wow.
Before she finally passed away. She finally passed away as almost a 12-year-old coyote, which is a really old coyote. And she passed away from natural causes. So it was kidney failure. That's also really rare for a coyote to die from natural causes. And she was an amazing animal. She was an alpha. So she was only a transient the first year. After that, she found her mate. They made their territory. Those were in the early years before the area became saturated with all these other resident territories. So there was space that they could create, and so she was able to to create that with her mate. Her mate, he was number 115. He did end up getting a nickname. We did call him Melonhead because he had a really big head, but he was an amazing animal. So they were together until she died. So for that would be almost 9 years they were together as a mated pair, and their territory. The other thing that was really interesting was that it was completely within a suburban area. So it was about 4 miles from O'Hare International Airport. So it was highly developed. It's Schaumburg, Illinois, is the town. If anyone wants to look it up, so it's
I know
it's completely surrounded by other towns, or if you want to call them towns. And her territory was bounded by Interstate 290 and Interstate 90. So it's highly developed, and they were able to live with Schaumburg residents for that whole time without any incidents or conflicts. So they were really good at restricting their activities to nighttime so that they were able to stay largely hidden from people. And this was in the years before Ring cameras and Facebook becoming, such a hot thing.
Yeah.
And so that was one thing. And then the other thing, they were really, really good at crossing roads. So they were crossing some major roads every single night of their lives, and didn't get hit by cars.
Yeah, I did an episode with the Panthers down in Florida, and the biggest thing to them of them losing them is usually car accidents, cars hitting them more than anything else.
Sure. Yeah. Especially, mountain lions for sure are super vulnerable. Large carnivores tend to be highly sensitive to traffic. Coyotes, it is true that cars are the number one cause of mortality for urban coyotes. So, they do get hit to some degree. But just because it's the number one cause of mortality does not mean that they're just getting hit left and right on the roads. In fact, most of them are really, really good at documenting in their own minds traffic patterns and learning, where are good places to cross the roads, because there are different places that are better than others, and also different patterns of traffic. So some traffic might stop if they have lights or stop signs. Other traffic will not. So it will change the way that they cross the road.
So that's hilarious. So they have coyote crossings, basically, is what it is. That's kind of cool.
They do. They use the same crossings we do.
Yeah, that's wild. That's really cool. So how many are there? And I'm going to get to the longest living one number now, but how many are there altogether that you guys have tagged right now that are out there?
We typically try to have about 50 to 60 coyotes radio collared at any one time.
Okay.
So we're above that right now, just because it's the time of the year. So most of our trapping that we do takes place during the winter for a variety of reasons, and so that's our time to try to get the radio collars distributed. And then during the course of the year, that number will decline. Either they leave, they move, or they die for one reason or another. So we're above that number. I think we're closer to 80 right now, but it'll average about 50.
So what's the lowest number, and how old is that coyote now?
So I think the lowest right now, I'd have to look, because it does change. Our lowest number it's pretty high now. It's around 1,170 something.
Wow.
Yeah, so we're at 16. We're about 1,680 coyotes that we've marked so far.
And how many do you think that actually live in the city? I know you've got the 80 right now, but how many do you actually think live in the city? I'm sure it's a guesstimate, but what do you think?
It's definitely a guesstimate. So if you mean city, like the city limits of Chicago.
Well, let's just go with Cook County.
Of Cook County. Right. So Cook County, we have modeled that number. And so it's probably in most years ranges between 2,000 and 4,000 coyotes.
That's unbelievable to me. I'd lived on the North Shore for a couple of years, a long, long time ago. But I go to Chicago. I'm sure they see coyotes, but I never saw one over there. That's crazy.
I know they're just really, really good at staying hidden from us. They're just really. I was just I was just on another interview with someone about this, and then they were asking me about that. What's so amazing about them and what they're doing? I said, well, there's a million things that have been amazing about this study, but
Right.
I mean, the one that we often forget about because we see it every single day, and it loses its awesomeness, if you want to call it that.
I like that word.
Yeah, it is, but I have to remind myself, and I try to convey this to people, and that is, imagine that you're given this charge that you're you're told you're going to go live somewhere, and you have to live and hunt and find your food, find your mate, defend your territory, and you have to do it in an area among 9 million of your
Right.
predators of you. And so you have to live among them, but you have to learn how to avoid them.
And survive.
So how do you avoid 9 million people and live among them? That's what they do every single day.
I want to learn from them. There's a lot of people I want to avoid. That's pretty funny.
I know. It's just and we forget about it because I mean we're seeing these guys all the time,
Right.
but it's one of the most amazing things that we take for granted every day.
So let's get into food because we talked about it before, but I'm I, I I think it's amazing. But let's talk about what they typically eat, and then the natural assumption. And I think you know where I'm going to go with. I'm going to let you talk about that. What do they normally eat? And let's talk about the guys in Cook County that you've been studying. What do they eat, and where do they find it, and all that kind of stuff?
So what do they normally eat, like out in their natural habitat?
Okay.
So they are extremely good at hunting small prey. So that would be your mice, voles. Voles are like one of their favorite foods of all of the rodents that they eat. Rabbits. Up north, it would be snowshoe hare, that type of thing. And then they also rely heavily on scavenging. And if you think about their evolution, so they've been around, there have been coyotes, that species, for at least 1 million years. And during that, most of those million years, they were also living in a very hostile and dangerous landscape where we had in North America all of these large carnivores that are extinct now. But that's what they evolved to live with. And so they took advantage of the foods provided by those large carnivores, kind of similar to us today. And they would scavenge. So scavenging while avoiding being eaten by those or killed by those predators was a major part of their strategy, in addition to hunting their own small prey. Now, without those large carnivores, um, we do have cases now in more recent years, say in the last couple of hundred years, where coyotes, if the conditions are okay, if there's appropriate, they will take advantage of hunting large prey, and they are capable of doing that again when the conditions are appropriate. So their capabilities of eating natural foods range all the way from the tiniest mice all the way up to the large ungulates. And in fact, I did a study of coyotes up in Nova Scotia. It was Cape Breton Island, so it's an island off of Nova Scotia, and we documented coyotes there learning how to hunt and kill moose.
Wow.
So those were 700 and 800 pound animals, and the coyotes weren't any bigger than the coyotes in Chicago. So that's a huge, what we call a dietary niche. So it's also a key to their success because they can exploit and take advantage of such a wide range of foods, even in a natural environment.
Well, one of the things when we talked before, and I want to talk about it because I found that interesting too, is naturally for me, when I'm thinking about in the city, I'm thinking they're probably eating all the rats, but they're not. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So again, another assumption that we had as well. I mean, we made a lot of assumptions about how coyotes might possibly live in a city when we started this work, and we found that I found that I was wrong about everything. I completely underestimated them. And one of the things that people usually assume is that, well, one of the benefits of living in the city for these coyotes is that they're obviously eating rats and mice, the house mouse.
Right.
So those commensal rodents is what we call them. And in Chicago, that seems like a reasonable assumption because there's an abundant rat population.
Right.
And in fact, it usually see a number somewhere about 5 million rats for the city. So you think, well, that's an easy lifestyle. But what we found so far, anyway, is that it's actually very rare for these coyotes to take rats. And we'll see if that continues. But they typically do not take and eat the rats. They avoid them for the most part.
And the reason why they avoid them, the assumption is because of they've been poisoned or they've got some poison in them.
So that's my assumption.
Okay.
And there are some other people. I mean, I'm not the only one that's
Using your assumption. I like your assumption.
right. So I mean, that's one of our explanations for it. I mean, the bottom line is we don't understand why they're not eating them, but uh, the explanation that I think is the best one is that there is a poisoning program that takes place in Chicago, and it's been there forever. And it wouldn't be surprise me whatsoever that coyotes at some point experienced a bad reaction
Right.
to eating a rat. And again, they're so smart; they learn so quick. That's another key to their success is their ability to learn and change their behavior on the spot. And that also is true when you attempt to poison them through poisoning their carcasses. It's one reason why in some cases, poisoning programs don't work very well for them. A lot of people have tried to use that as a deterrent for example, livestock predation by lacing sheep carcasses with something that makes them vomit or makes them sick. It doesn't work very well because coyotes actually learn like which carcasses might actually have that and which ones do not. So they're so good at that. But that's just an example of how they're highly sensitive to these types of things and they adjust to them very quickly. So that's my thought, but we don't know exactly what's going on there.
So in the city, they're eating mice and whatever else that aren't rats, and then I'm assuming they're probably eating some of the from the restaurants when they have food sitting out or in the trash cans. Do they do that too?
Some of them do,
Okay.
and that's another assumption that we had was that especially for coyotes. So again, rats are only available really in the urban core.
Right.
So when you get out into the suburbs, you don't see city rats or Norway rats or that type of thing. They don't really get that far from the city because they are completely dependent on people and dependent on an highly urban, I guess, environment. So once you get away from that, they drop off the landscape pretty quick. And we assumed that coyotes across the metro area would be benefiting from human foods, just like raccoons and opossums and skunks and that type of thing. And some of them are, but many of them, in fact, the majority of them are not. So the majority of them are still eating what you might call natural foods, such as those prey items, scavenging. In fact, we provide them with a lot of scavenging opportunities by hitting deer with our cars
Oh,
and some other animals. Yeah, so deer actually showed up, I think roughly about 20% of their diet, at least in the suburbs where the deer populations are pretty high. So they take advantage of that. And then there's fruit and some seasonal items that are still natural, not the fruit and garbage. But then you do have garbage that's there at any time, all the time. And you do have people actually putting out food for them. And so some coyotes do take the step over into the dark world and they do take some human food. And there are some coyotes that have a diet that looks very similar to yours and mine. So they're almost eating human food exclusively.
right. Now, when we talked to you said there's how many generations are there of coyotes now that are just city dwellers? That I mean, is it the second generation or third since you started studying them, and they've never been anywhere other than in the urban areas?
Yeah, so I mean, we don't know exactly when the first generation started down in the city. We started our work up in the suburbs, but if you, I know that they were not typically seen down in the Corps until the later aught years. So, and we actually caught our first one, I believe it was 2009, down in the city. So if you want to, we'll just use that as a very rough starting point. A generation is actually like every 2 to 3 years. So we're looking at probably about, I'd say that makes it maybe 8 or 9 generations,
Wow, that's crazy.
at least. That's minimum.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's conservative.
So you've got, let's use 10 as just to round it out. So you got 10 generations that never really been out in the wild. That's crazy. It's pretty cool.
Right, exactly. Yep. And yeah, that's all they know. That's all they know is how to live in the city.
And so I wonder how have they done any studies where they've taken a couple, like a pair and putting them in the wild and they survive, if they've done that, or if they've talked about doing something like that?
So we did do that. Not to answer that question, but it's just a little side study.
Yeah.
We just as a service to the Animal Control Agency, we would so occasionally they would get called about a coyote found down in a very urban spot, like a parking lot, or maybe behind a building or in a garage down in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And so the animal control agents would have to come take that animal, and they didn't want to euthanize it, so they would take it out and release it.
Mm-hmm.
So as part of just a little side study, we went ahead, since we had extra radio collars, we would go ahead and radio collar one of those those animals and release them at the edge of the Chicago metro area, like way out on the edge of Cook County and Kane County, basically. So basically, this animal had an option of going west to cornfields galore, or going east back toward the city. And of course, they were released in a nice big natural area, huge, large forest preserve. And they always left; they never stayed. But so far, I mean, of the ones that we were able to follow, because some of them disappeared, but the ones we were able to follow, they all went back east. Now, that doesn't mean that they were necessarily going east because they wanted to get back into the city, but there is a suspicion that they do have a homing instinct, and that might have been the factor. But the bigger factor, though, this is the problem of trying to do that kind of a study that you're talking about, is that they all died. They all died before they settled anywhere.
Oh.
So they all got hit by cars, or they got shot by people.
Yeah, they weren't familiar with their surroundings, so they didn't have a chance to learn. Oh, that's too bad.
Correct, exactly. And they can't stay where you release them, especially if it's if you think that looks like really good habitat for a coyote, it's probably already occupied. And so
Yeah,
we were just
yeah.
talking about the territorial structure that they have. Is like you're literally dumping this poor animal right smack in the middle of an occupied territory, and of course it's going to leave. It's by itself, and
Right.
the residents are going to kick it out.
Oh, that's wild. Can we talk a little bit about some of the myths about coyotes? One of the things I read, and again, it's on the internet, so you never know what you're getting, but it said that the chance of a human being being bit by a coyote, you're more of a chance of getting hit by a golf ball and killing you, because they're not really that aggressive unless they feel they're threatened.
Yeah. So I haven't seen that on the internet, and I'm not a golfer.
I'm not either.
So I don't know. I don't know what that risk actually is.
Well, if I'm playing, it's a big risk. But anyway.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So what I can say, though, is I know how many fatal incidents there have been from coyotes that's been documented, and it's been two.
Two.
So a small child was killed in Los Angeles in 1981, I believe. So I was a 3-year-old, unfortunately. And then in 2009, a 19-year-old female was hiking by herself. She died from injuries from a coyote attack. Then that was up in Cape Breton Island, and that was the reason why we did our study up there, was to figure out why coyotes were attacking people in that one particular park. but it's extremely rare. So that's, there's been records going back to the 1960s in terms of incidents between coyotes and people, but it's very rare. And so going back to the 60s, I mean, you're talking about 60 plus years of documentation and only 2 fatalities. I don't want to minimize those fatalities. I mean, they're actually, I think, important reminders to people.
It can happen.
Yeah, that it can happen. That sometimes people might underestimate these animals and do something that's not smart, that might put the person at risk that doesn't need to be. And so it's important to remember that these incidents did happen, so that we respect the animal, and we don't create a more I guess dangerous situation than need be.
Okay, so another question. So, one of the, and again, I didn't read this, so this is my question to you. So, if I'm in an urban area, there's coyotes. I'm here in Austin. If I have a small dog or a cat, do they ever go after those like most people assume, or is that a rare thing too?
It is a rare thing, but it's definitely more common than what we were just talking about with people.
Right.
So with cats, so outdoor cats, that's an interesting thing. So we do know that coyotes do take cats occasionally. They don't take them as frequently or as often as what people think, and that's something we discovered. So we did do also as a companion study to the coyote research. I did a large feral cat study where we radio collared cats. I had to create my own cat colonies, and I created them in areas where we had coyotes, also radio tracking them, and we had a long history of knowing a lot about those coyotes there. And so I assumed in extremely high coyote numbers, I mean, relative for coyotes. So it should have been a very dangerous area for cats to be. And I assumed that there's going to be a fairly high level of mortality. But we actually documented a relatively low level of predation by coyotes. And it's because the cats, especially outdoor cats that are outdoors all the time, are very, very smart in their own right. And they actually were very cognizant of where coyotes were spending their time, and they avoided it like the plague.
And why would too?
Right. But we also, while we're radio tracking, most of the radio tracking we do of these coyotes, we have to do it physically. So we're actually tracking them at night, or I have a team of people that tracks them at night. And occasionally we do see cats and coyotes that, encounter each other. And in some cases, the coyote just ignores the cat altogether. In other cases, the cat's actually aggressive toward the coyote and makes the coyote run off. And we rarely, I don't think we've ever seen a coyote actually take a cat, but we have seen some cat remains that we do know were coyote related. So it does happen.
Right.
So that's that long answer to that, which is they will take cats. It doesn't happen as much as people think, but it does happen. And so if you do care about your cat, you may want to think twice about letting out in areas where coyotes are spending their time.
Like it's right across the street from me.
Right across the street.
Yeah, I don't have a cat though, so I'm good.
Right. And like I said, some cats, I mean, one of those cats that, as part of my study, we had five cats out of 160 that we radio tracked, and 5 of them acted like they were coyotes. So they did not avoid the areas where coyotes were spending their time. They went right into the middle of those territories. They were fearless, and they could care less. And they were studs. Those cats were.
I was going to say stud cats. Exactly.
They were stud cats. Exactly.
That's great. That's awesome.
Yeah, and they lived all the way through the study, so it's not like it was temporary. They knew how to act toward coyotes. But coyotes and dogs, again, in most cases, coyotes are avoiding dogs because dogs are associated with us, and they have a strong fear of us. But there are times, every once in a while, when coyotes do become aggressive toward dogs. There can be cases where a coyote, for reasons that we don't understand, just resists its fear of people, and all of a sudden becomes very aggressive toward dogs, and becomes progressively worse and worse until they might have to be removed. But those are also pretty rare as well.
Well, the other thing I like too, when I would start doing all the digging into this thing, is all the mythology that comes with the coyotes, the trickster thing and all that. What's funny is, because Native Americans have got they're either bad guys or good guys. It's funny, it depends on what part of the Native America area you're in. But one will be bad, they're bad guys, and the other one they're good guys. I think it's pretty funny how it goes across the board on all that.
Right. Well, that's the role of the trickster. So
Right.
that's the trickster in Native American mythology. Um, Basically, every Native American nation, as part of their mythology, they always have a trickster character. So in the eastern part of North America, where coyotes didn't occur, other species took the trickster character. But almost all of the tribes west of the Mississippi had the coyote as the trickster character, and they need that trickster because that's the funny animal. That's the animal that assumes different shapes, that assumes different roles in the story.
Right.
So that's why there could be a bad character in one story, but there could be a good character or a funny one in the next story. So that's the role they played. And it's ironic that Native Americans selected coyotes for that role, because I would say that we're looking at the same thing happening today.
Yeah.
With coyotes living in cities.
Well, one of the ones I read, I loved it, is I think it was one of the gods. They took away from the coyote, they took away his laughter, and they created the first lie. Because he couldn't laugh, he started lying.
Huh.
I mean, I love reading that stuff.
Yep.
I just think it's fascinating the way they do that. And the name coyote came back from, I think, from the Mayans or the Aztecs or something, from way back when in 1500s or something like that.
Yeah, as an Aztec derivation. Yep.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. But before we get done, I want to talk about a couple things. I want to talk about your book. I know you've got a book out. Let's put it out there so people know about it if they want to learn more. You've got your book. So can you talk just briefly about that? I know you can find it everywhere, but can you talk a little bit about that, and then the couple, with the Cook Project and the McGraw thing too, just so everybody knows what they are.
Sure. So the book is called Coyotes Among Us: Secrets of the City's Top Predator. We published that last year, and the reason why I wanted to do a book is that a large part of this urban coyote research is outreach. So at least a large part of our responsibilities is not just to publish our work in scientific journals for our own peers, but it is to extend what we're learning about these animals to the general public. And so we've created a website. It's called urbancoyoteresearch.com. So it generally gets about 300,000 visits a year. So that's where we'll put and post a lot of the results from the research that we're doing for the public. And then the book was just another way to basically share the stories that we've been learning from these coyotes to, again, the general public. So that's the book. The partners, the agencies that are responsible for supporting this research would be first the Max McGraw Wildlife Foundation. That's the foundation where I began my work in Chicago as that research biologist many years ago. And they've been extremely supportive of this long-term research. So 25-year studies are rare in any sense, studying anything, to be able to have funding.
Well, remember when you started, it was going to be 1 year.
Right. It was supposed to be 1 year. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so to find partners or agencies that are willing to support a research project for this long is just really rare. So, and the foundation is our home base. That's the place where our lab is, and that's where the technicians live and work. And then we also have the Cook County Animal Control and the Forest Preserve District of Cook County. Those are also funding agencies, as well as our partners in the field for this amazing research. It's not possible. It's also a really expensive thing to try to do. And we're very lucky to have these partners that are able to support that as well.
And one last thing that you didn't mention too, you're the senior editor of the Urban Carnivore associated with John Hopkins or somebody. I can't.
Right. Yeah. So I published another book called Urban Carnivores. That was back in 2010. The publisher was Johns Hopkins University Press. And that's a bit more of an academic book, but it's also read by people that are interested in, when we say urban carnivores, we're talking about mammalian predators, basically. So we mentioned mountain lions out in LA. There's
Yeah.
quite the mountain lion population. So there's a chapter in there on mountain lions. It's basically any of the species that have received some decent amount of research attention in cities basically gets their own chapter in this book. And so I edited. There's different contributors. So the researchers that have studied these different animals, such as Seth Riley, does the study of mountain lions out there. They each contributed a chapter of their study species and how those different animals are living in cities.
And for everybody that's listening, I'm going to have all this information in the description of you're listening now, so it's already in there, but it will be in the description of the episode so we can find that. Okay, so last thing that I forewarned you is that, and people who listen, they know, I always have a silly animal joke, and I try to make it relative somewhat to the subject. And I know you haven't heard some of them, so you're just going to have to grin and bear it. Everybody else is. But again, for everybody, as I always say every time, if you want your kids, your grandkids, nieces, nephews, whatever, to tell the joke, please send me an email at mkyle@forrealpodcast.com. And I guarantee I'll put you on, because I cringe every time, and I know you cringe more when I did it. So for you, here we go, Stan. Wait a minute, wrong one.
So it's already funny.
It's already bad. So why did the coyote break up with her boyfriend?
I don't know.
Because he's being too much of a lone wolf. That's how bad they are. Anyway,
Okay.
so there it is. So first off, thanks so much for being on the show, Stan. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I find it fascinating. I'm sure everybody else listening does too. So really, thanks for taking the time for that.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for having me, and thanks for your interest in animals.
Oh, it's so great. And then for everybody else that's listening, as I always say, keep following, listening, tell people about this episode. If you've got a great idea, send me an email there as well. But most importantly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for listening. For real.
That concludes this episode of For Real with your host, Mark Kyle. For previous and future episodes of For Real, listen via all major podcast streaming sites.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's LIBSYN, ads.com today.